Okay, now that we've set a conceptual baseline for why we separate out the logic from the presentation when we build out code, we're going to start looking at some practical techniques for modifying the output of Drupal, some of which are going to take code and going to take that separation of logic from presentation, but a lot of them are going to be based on configuration changes in Drupal or contributed modules that allow us to modify certain aspects of Drupal that are very difficult to do from the code side of things. And we'll also take a look at several techniques that employ CSS to override the location of a certain aspect or hide a certain component on the page. If you've ever had to make a modification to Drupal output and found your head spinning a bit because you just weren't sure how to approach it, there's a good reason for that. And it's because there's usually multiple approaches you can take to modify the same thing. Typically, some of them will have advantages over others. And so what we're going to do next is take a look at what tools we have in our toolbox to make those modifications. And then we'll take a look at how to match up a modification to a particular technique based on our needs. Probably the simplest tool we have available to us are the variety of settings that Drupal supplies us. For example, if we go to edit a content type, we see that there are a number of ways that we can modify the output of a teaser or a full page output for a node. For example, we can hide a particular label, we can change the order of fields, or change how the field is output with a field formatter. There are also settings that allow us to structure the location of our blocks throughout a page as columns or in the main content of the page or the header or footer. There are also more general settings which we can modify, including the site name and uploading a new site logo or favicon. Besides these, there are multiple additional points where the output of Drupal can be modified through simple configuration changes. And the advantage to taking this approach, if we can, is that it's expected. So anybody who comes to administer a Drupal site will check these locations first because they're common across all Drupal sites. It also allows us to reduce the amount of custom code that's required to get the output that we would like, which will ultimately make our site more maintainable. Another tool that's available to us is to extend the configuration options available through the user interface by installing contributed modules. For example, in a future video we're going to look at the Display Suite module, which allows us to add custom build modes to our nodes. A build mode, for example, is a teaser or a full page. Those are two different build nodes. And to add an additional build node would typically require some coding. But with Display Suite, we can add an additional build mode through the user interface and allow the user to use those in views, for example, or on various pages on the site. The advantage to this approach over adding custom code is the same as using the core configuration pages. It gives us the opportunity to reduce the amount of custom code required on our site while exposing more of the data to people in a way that is standard across many Drupal sites. So not all sites will have a particular contributed module installed, but there are modules that are standard enough that if people want that functionality exposed, they will go to a particular module for it. So they'll know where to go for more information or documentation. A third tool we have to work with is CSS. CSS allows us to position elements on a page or give a particular look or feel or even hide an element on a page without having to create any custom code. Again, using this technique allows us to reduce the amount of custom code required for our site to run, and this is often a standard way of positioning or changing the visual aspects of elements on a page. So that will be where people will look to. They'll look to the CSS files. One more tool that we'll look at for modifying the output of Drupal through the theme layer is through the theme settings form. And we'll look at not only what the default settings enable us to do, but also how to extend these settings and add an additional user interface for users to be able to, for example, change the color of a certain element on the page or change the text that's used for certain UI elements. The next three tools can be used on the theme layer, and those are template files, theme functions, and preprocessing functions. Both template files and theme functions are used by modules and core Drupal in order to hand off the presentation of certain data over to the theme layer. Template files will more often be used in situations where the output will need to be modified by people with very little programming experience. The template file will contain basic HTML and some very simple PHP statements. Whereas with theming functions, the user is required to at least be able to recognize the syntax of a function and be able to pull out variables in an array, for example, and use them within a theme function. Theme functions are usually easier to implement, and oftentimes they're more effective if the output does not need to be modified that often by people with little programming experience. A preprocessing function allows us to intercept data as it gets passed from a module to a template file or a theming function and perform any additional logic that we need to that data. So for example, say we have a percentage and we want to add a particular class to the output if it's a positive percentage and another class if it's negative, say so it shows up as green or red if it's negative. Now we wouldn't want to put this logic inside of the template file or theme function because that would add logic to what should be mostly presentation. And we also wouldn't modify the module where this code was coming from unless it was a custom module, but we wouldn't modify contributed modules or core modules. So what we can do is add our logic inside of this preprocessing function. And this is an interesting point where the themer often has to have some development chops in order to get what they need done. For example, to do this, we need to use an operator to say, hey, is this percentage positive or is it negative? And if so, we're going to use some string concatenation to add some class around this particular content. And all of that is very development oriented. But this is in the theme where this preprocessing function would occur. So it's up to the people who are doing this development to decide whether this type of task is going to be the developer's role or the themer's role. But oftentimes, both the themer and developer will need to have some idea about how preprocessing functions work. There's also a third set of tools available to us, which are at the module layer. I mentioned earlier that there's an advantage to making changes through configuration or contributed modules or simple syntax like CSS because it reduces the amount of custom code added to our site. Now, the flip side to this is when we want to create custom code, in order to make it portable across multiple sites, configuration can be difficult to transport from one site to another, though there are ways, for example by using the features module. But if we want to encapsulate our code inside of a module that we can use easily across multiple sites and also to maybe contribute back to Drupal.org, then making the changes in the module directly, making these modifications to the output, can be a very big advantage. And these include alter functions, which allow us to plug into a page, for example, before it's rendered to reorganize blocks or add additional content to it. Or we can alter the output of a form, for example, through the form API. We can also alter the output of a block or a node before it gets rendered into HTML, and at that point, it becomes very difficult to work with. Another way is by adding additional text formats to the field API. So what this does is allow us to output our text in a particular way and format it in a particular way that can then be reused across multiple fields. So I mentioned this earlier when we were talking about configuration options for node output. When we go to the display tab, we see that there's a number of selections that we can use for various inputs or various fields in our node. And we can add an additional item to that select box that will format that code in a particular way, which we can then apply to any field that we would like. One final way that we can modify the output of our code through a module is by adding additional text format options. So you may be familiar with this by using the text format dialog to, for example, set up a format that just anonymous users can use to post to a site, which will clean up HTML and only allow certain users to use the full range of HTML tags. Well, we can add additional filters to the text formats to allow us to modify that output in some other way. And we can also apply custom text formatters to certain content in a programmatic way, either in our theme through a preprocessing function or in our code as well.